The radio is dead. We're not going to make it." The pilot's voice cracked as he stared at the shattered communications panel, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. Around him, 8 survivors huddled in the wreckage of the downed helicopter, surrounded by miles of frozen wilderness with no cell signal, no emergency beacon, and temperatures dropping toward fatal. A young executive pulled out his phone for the 100th time, desperately searching for a bar of service that would never appear. "We're all going to die out here," he whispered. But in the corner of the mangled cabin, an 80-year-old man was quietly dismantling a flashlight, his weathered hands steady as stone. No one paid attention to him. No one thought to ask what he was doing. They would later learn that Walter Brennan had spent 2 years sending messages through the darkness of the Korean War, and he wasn't about to stop now. If this story moves you, type "rescue" in the comments and stay until the end. The charter helicopter had taken off from Anchorage at 7 in the morning, carrying 9 passengers to a remote corporate retreat in the Alaskan interior. The flight was supposed to take 2 hours. The weather report had promised clear skies. But Alaska doesn't make promises, and the storm that materialized over the Chugach Mountains came without warning, a wall of white fury that swallowed the helicopter like a beast consuming prey. The pilot, a veteran of 15 years of bush flying, fought the controls with everything he had. It wasn't enough. The aircraft clipped a ridge hidden in the whiteout and tumbled down a steep ravine. Metal screaming, rotors shattering, passengers thrown against restraints that barely held. When the world finally stopped spinning, 3 people were dead, 2 were critically injured, and the survivors found themselves stranded in a frozen hell with no way to call for help. The emergency locator transmitter had been destroyed in the impact. The radio was a sparking ruin of torn wires and shattered circuits. Their cell phones were useless, expensive rectangles of glass and metal that mocked them with "no service" messages. They were alone, invisible, forgotten by a world that had no idea they had fallen from the sky. Walter Brennan had been the last passenger to board that morning, an old man in a worn canvas jacket who had taken the seat nearest the rear of the cabin without complaint. The corporate executives had barely noticed him, too absorbed in their laptops and quarterly projections to pay attention to someone who clearly wasn't part of their world. He was traveling to visit his granddaughter, who worked as a wildlife biologist at a research station near their destination. The ticket had been a birthday gift from his son, a chance to see family he hadn't visited in years. Walter had accepted it reluctantly. He didn't like flying. Hadn't liked it since his time in the military, but he loved his granddaughter more than he feared the sky. Now, sitting in the wreckage with the cold already seeping through his jacket, he assessed the situation with the calm detachment of a man who had seen worse. Much worse. Korea had taught him that panic was a luxury no one could afford when survival hung in the balance. He had been 20 years old when the Chinese army surrounded his unit at Chosin Reservoir. 20 years old when he had watched friends freeze to death in foxholes. 20 years old when he had learned that the human will to survive could overcome almost anything if you refused to surrender to despair. 60 years later, that lesson remained carved into his bones. The group's natural leader emerged quickly, as one always does in crisis. His name was Marcus Webb, a 42-year-old executive who had built his career on projecting confidence and taking charge of situations. He organized the survivors efficiently, directing the able-bodied to gather supplies from the wreckage, assigning someone to tend to the injured, establishing a perimeter of sorts around the crash site. His commands were crisp, authoritative, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But beneath the confidence, fear was eating him alive. He had never faced anything like this. His crises had always involved spreadsheets and market fluctuations, problems that could be solved with phone calls and negotiations. This was different. This was nature, indifferent and lethal, and his MBA hadn't included a course on surviving helicopter crashes in the Alaskan wilderness. When he inventoried their resources, the reality became terrifyingly clear. They had limited food, minimal first aid supplies, inadequate shelter, and no way to signal for help. The pilot estimated they were at least 50 miles from the nearest settlement, in terrain that would kill an experienced mountaineer attempting to cross on foot. Their only hope was rescue, but no one knew exactly where they had gone down, and the storm had likely erased any visual trace of their crash path. They were invisible, a needle hidden in a haystack the size of a small country. Walter watched the younger man struggle with the weight of command, recognizing the signs of someone approaching the edge of their capabilities. He had seen it before in young officers who had never tasted combat, men who had all the training and none of the experience, whose confidence evaporated when theory collided with the brutal reality of survival. He didn't judge Marcus for it. Leadership in crisis wasn't something you could learn in a classroom. It was forged in fire, tested by circumstances that stripped away everything except what you truly were. Walter had found his own leadership forged in the frozen mountains of Korea, where he had kept 12 men alive for 9 days behind enemy lines, with nothing but determination and skills he had learned from his father, a railroad telegrapher who had taught his son Morse code before he taught him to ride a bicycle. That knowledge had saved his life more than once. It had allowed him to tap messages on pipes to prisoners in adjacent cells when the Chinese had captured him. It had let him communicate with rescue aircraft when his radio was destroyed. And now, as he looked at the shattered helicopter and the terrified survivors huddled inside, he wondered if those same skills might save them all again. Night fell like a hammer, and with it came cold that seemed to have claws. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero, then 20, then kept falling into depths that turned breath into ice crystals and made exposed skin burn with frostbite within minutes. The survivors huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in a desperate biological calculation. The injured moaned softly, their pain muted by shock and the creeping numbness of hypothermia. Marcus tried to keep spirits up, talking about rescue protocols, about how search parties were probably already being organized, about how they just needed to hold on until morning. But his words rang hollow, and everyone knew it. The storm still raged outside, visibility measured in inches rather than feet. No aircraft could fly in these conditions. No search party could navigate terrain they couldn't see. They were on their own, and the cold was patient, relentless, eternal. It would wait for them to weaken, then take them one by one. Walter sat slightly apart from the group, his mind working through possibilities the way it had 60 years ago. He had noticed something during his assessment of the wreckage, something that had sparked an idea. The helicopter's metal skin was intact in several large sections, and metal was an excellent reflector. The flashlight in his pocket still worked, its beam strong and focused. And somewhere out there, beyond the storm, there had to be someone watching. There was always someone watching. You just had to find a way to make them see you. By the second day, hope had begun to die. The storm had cleared enough to reveal their location, a narrow ravine surrounded by peaks that blocked any line of sight to populated areas. Marcus had sent 2 of the younger survivors to climb to a ridge and attempt to signal with a mirror, but they had returned defeated, reporting nothing but endless wilderness in every direction. The injured were deteriorating rapidly, their bodies losing the fight against trauma and cold. Food was nearly gone. Water came from melted snow, a laborious process that consumed precious energy and provided minimal return. The pilot, whose injuries had seemed minor at first, had developed a fever that suggested internal damage beyond their ability to treat. He might not survive another night. The group's morale had collapsed into a kind of numb resignation, the quiet acceptance of people who had stopped believing in rescue. Marcus still gave orders, but his voice had lost its authority, his commands more habit than conviction. No one blamed him. There was simply nothing left to try. They had shouted themselves hoarse, built signal fires that produced more smoke than visibility, waved bright clothing at empty skies. The world had forgotten them, and soon the cold would finish what the crash had started. Walter had spent those 2 days preparing. While others despaired, he had worked with methodical patience, salvaging materials from the wreckage, testing angles and positions, waiting for the right moment. The flashlight was his key, but a flashlight beam traveled in a straight line and dissipated quickly over distance. To be seen from any significant range, he needed to amplify the signal, focus it, turn a simple household light into something that could cut through miles of darkness. He had found his solution in the helicopter's landing light, a powerful halogen unit that had survived the crash intact. Its reflector dish was designed to concentrate illumination, to throw light in a tight beam that pilots could use to examine terrain during night landings. Combined with his flashlight's batteries and some creative rewiring that would have impressed the engineers who had trained him decades ago, Walter had created something new. A signaling device capable of sending focused pulses of light across distances that would have been impossible with the flashlight alone. All he needed was darkness, a clear line of sight, and someone out there who remembered how to read the oldest language of emergency communication. On the second night, the clouds finally broke enough to reveal stars. Walter climbed out of the wreckage and began his work. The others thought he had lost his mind. Marcus watched the old man positioning his jury-rigged contraption on a flat section of the helicopter's hull, aiming it toward a distant ridge that seemed to lead nowhere. "Mr. Brennan, what are you doing? You need to conserve your strength." Walter didn't turn around. His fingers moved over the device, making final adjustments with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "I'm calling for help, son." Marcus exchanged glances with the other survivors, the kind of look people share when they're witnessing someone's final break from reality. "The radio is destroyed. There's no cell signal. How exactly are you planning to call anyone?" Walter finally turned, and something in his eyes made Marcus take a step back. There was no confusion there, no desperation, no madness, just calm, absolute certainty, the look of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "I'm going to tap a message in Morse code using light pulses. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, SOS. Then our coordinates, best I can estimate. I'm going to repeat it every 30 seconds until someone sees it or I run out of battery. And someone will see it, son. Someone always sees it. You just have to keep signaling until they do." He turned back to his device and began to tap. 23 miles away, at a small airfield that served as a staging point for rescue operations, a young Coast Guard ensign named David Park was monitoring the darkness through a high-powered telescope. The search for the missing helicopter had been suspended due to weather, but David had volunteered to maintain a visual watch, more out of restlessness than expectation. He had been scanning the mountains for hours, seeing nothing but snow and shadow, when a flicker of light caught his attention. It was faint, barely visible, a pinprick of illumination that pulsed against the darkness of a distant ridge. He almost dismissed it as a reflection, starlight bouncing off ice, the kind of visual noise that cluttered night observation. But something made him keep watching, some instinct that had been trained into him during long hours of communication drills. The light pulsed again. 3 short flashes. 3 long flashes. 3 short flashes. David's coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. He lunged for his radio, his voice cracking with excitement and disbelief. "Base, this is Observation Post 7. I have a visual on what appears to be a Morse code distress signal, bearing northeast approximately 20 miles. Someone is sending SOS. Repeat, someone is sending SOS. They're alive out there. They're alive and they're signaling." The rescue helicopter launched within the hour, guided by the steady pulse of Walter's light through the darkness. They found the crash site just before dawn, 9 survivors clinging to life in the wreckage of what should have been their tomb. The medical team moved with urgent efficiency, stabilizing the injured, treating hypothermia, loading passengers onto stretchers with the careful haste of people who understood that minutes mattered. Marcus Webb stood in the snow, wrapped in a thermal blanket, watching the old man who had saved them all being helped toward the helicopter. Walter moved slowly, exhausted, his hands still trembling from hours of continuous signaling in the frozen air. But he walked on his own 2 feet, refusing the stretcher that the paramedics offered. Some stubbornness, Marcus was beginning to understand, wasn't weakness. It was the thing that kept you alive when everything else failed. He intercepted Walter before he reached the helicopter, struggling to find words adequate for what he wanted to say. "How did you know? How did you know someone would see it?" Walter looked at him with eyes that had seen 60 years of life since Korea, eyes that carried memories of friends who hadn't made it home and promises to those who had. "I didn't know, son. I just knew that giving up was the only way to guarantee no one would. You keep signaling until someone answers. That's all any of us can do." The story made national news within days. The image of Walter Brennan, 80 years old, tapping Morse code on a makeshift signal device while younger survivors had surrendered to despair, captured something that resonated deeply with audiences across the country. Reporters discovered his military record, his service in Korea, his Bronze Star for actions during the Chosin Reservoir campaign. They learned that he had spent 2 years as a communications specialist, that he had taught Morse code to hundreds of soldiers, that he had kept the skills sharp across 6 decades because you never know when the old ways might be the only ways left. The corporate executives who had barely noticed him on the morning of the flight lined up to praise his heroism, to call him an inspiration, to express gratitude that words couldn't adequately convey. Marcus Webb gave interview after interview, his voice breaking each time he described the moment he realized the old man wasn't crazy. He was saving their lives. "I thought I was the leader," he said during one particularly emotional appearance. "I thought I was the one keeping everyone together. But when everything we relied on failed, when all our technology and confidence meant nothing, it was a man with skills from 60 years ago who brought us home. I'll never underestimate anyone again. I'll never assume that age means irrelevance. Walter Brennan taught me that experience isn't just about what you've learned. It's about what you've survived." Walter attended the memorial service for the 3 passengers who didn't survive the crash, standing in his old army dress uniform with medals he hadn't worn in decades. He spoke briefly, honoring their memory, expressing sorrow that his signal hadn't come soon enough to save everyone. It was the only time anyone saw him show emotion about the whole ordeal, tears running down weathered cheeks as he saluted 3 flag-draped photographs. He declined most interview requests after that, returning to his quiet life in Montana, to his morning coffee and evening walks and occasional visits from a granddaughter who now looked at him with new understanding of who her grandfather really was. The Coast Guard awarded him a civilian commendation for his actions. The Army National Guard invited him to speak at their communications school, where a new generation of soldiers sat in stunned silence as an 80-year-old man demonstrated signaling techniques that predated their grandparents. He accepted that invitation, standing before rows of young faces with a flashlight in his hand. "Technology fails," he told them. "Batteries die, satellites go dark. But knowledge, the things you carry in your head and your hands that stays with you until your last breath, learn the old ways, master them, because someday, in some frozen ravine or burning desert or flooded valley, those old ways might be the only thing standing between you and the darkness." Today, the Brennan Protocol has been adopted by several wilderness rescue organizations, requiring search teams to maintain continuous visual monitoring for light-based signals during night operations. A scholarship in Walter's name sends 1 student each year to emergency communications training. the helicopter company that operated the I-2 crashed aircraft has added basic Morse code instruction to its passenger safety briefings, a small laminated card tucked into every seat pocket alongside the emergency procedures. Walter Brennan passed away peacefully at 84, surrounded by family, his granddaughter holding his hand as he took his final breath. His headstone bears the epitaph he requested, words that had guided him through Korea, through decades of quiet life, and through one frozen night when everything depended on an old man with a flashlight and the determination to keep signaling until someone answered, still transmitting. Some people carry skills that the world has forgotten, knowledge that seems obsolete until the moment it becomes the difference between life and death. Walter Brennan carried his through 80 years of life, and when the moment came, those skills lit a beacon through 20 miles of darkness.